What if the greatest story ever lost was not destroyed, but simply forgotten? Imagine standing at the edge of a city that once breathed with light, movement, and ambition, only to find silence where history promised greatness. That is where the story of Tartaria leaves us, not with clear answers, but with a feeling that something once existed beyond what survived in books. The deeper you look, the more you realize that history is not a perfect record. It is a collection of memories, choices, and sometimes omissions. Civilizations rise believing they will last forever, their architecture built to challenge time itself, their ideas carried by generations who never imagine an ending. Yet time moves quietly, and when it changes direction, even the strongest foundations can disappear without explanation. The mystery surrounding Tartaria is not only about maps or buildings or old photographs. It is about the human need to understand where we came from and why certain stories fade while others remain. Every generation inherits fragments of the past, but not always the full picture. Wars reshape borders, disasters erase evidence, and progress replaces what once stood as proof of another era. What remains is interpretation. People search for meaning in ruins because ruins feel honest. They remind us that something real once stood there, something lived, something mattered. And when answers are missing, imagination fills the space left behind. Perhaps Tartaria represents more than a lost civilization. Perhaps it represents the uncomfortable truth that history is written by survival. What continues forward becomes official memory, while what falls behind slowly turns into myth. This does not mean the past was hidden intentionally, nor that every mystery holds a secret conspiracy. Sometimes history fades simply because people move on. New technologies emerge, new nations rise, and attention shifts toward the future. The past becomes quieter with each passing generation until only questions remain. And yet those questions matter. They remind us to look closer, to remain curious, to understand that knowledge is never complete. The idea of Tartaria captures imagination because it sits between possibility and uncertainty. It challenges the comfort of clear explanations and invites us to consider how much we truly know about the world before us. Maybe the real lesson is not about proving what Tartaria was, but about recognizing how easily stories can be lost when no one continues to tell them. In the end, the silence surrounding Tartaria feels less like an ending and more like an echo. An echo of cities once alive, of people who believed their world would endure, of moments that felt permanent until they weren't. History moves forward, but it always leaves shadows behind. And sometimes those shadows remind us that the past is never completely gone. It waits patiently for someone willing to ask questions again. There is something unsettling about abandoned history, something that lingers long after the facts disappear. When we look back at stories like Tartaria, we are not only searching for answers, we are searching for connection. Human beings want continuity. We want to believe that history flows clearly from one era to the next, that progress follows a straight line. But reality rarely works that way. Entire chapters can fade, replaced by new narratives that feel simpler, easier to understand. And in that transition, complexity is often lost. The idea of Tartaria survives because it represents a gap, a space where certainty should exist, but doesn't. Old structures, unusual accounts, forgotten references, all combine to create a sense that something larger once stood beyond common understanding. Whether Tartaria was a unified civilization or simply a misunderstood label used by old cartographers matters less than the emotion it creates. It reminds us that history is fragile, records burn, languages change, and meaning shifts over time. What one generation considers obvious, another may struggle to interpret centuries later. There is also a deeper human element in this mystery. Every civilization believes it stands at the peak of knowledge, convinced that the present moment is the most advanced point in history. Yet time repeatedly proves otherwise. Ideas once thought permanent disappear, replaced by new ways of thinking. Buildings crumble, technologies become obsolete, and achievements once celebrated slowly lose context. Tartaria, real or symbolic, becomes a reflection of that cycle: rise, transformation, and eventual forgetting. But forgetting does not erase existence. It only changes how existence is remembered. The past survives in fragments, in architecture, in stories passed quietly between generations, in questions that refuse to disappear completely. That is why mysteries endure. They keep curiosity alive. They encourage people to look beyond accepted explanations and explore the unknown with open minds. Not every mystery leads to a hidden truth, but every mystery reminds us that knowledge is always incomplete. As the story closes, what remains is not a final answer but a perspective. Tartaria becomes less about proving a lost empire and more about understanding how history evolves. The world we know today will one day be interpreted by future generations in ways we cannot predict. Details will be lost, meanings will change, and new questions will emerge. And perhaps, centuries from now, people will look back at our own time with the same uncertainty we feel today. In that sense, Tartaria is not only about the past, it is a quiet reminder of time itself, how it reshapes memory, how it softens certainty, and how it leaves behind just enough mystery to keep humanity searching. Every great mystery begins with something ordinary that no longer makes sense. A name on an old map, a structure that seems out of place, a story repeated without explanation. Over time, these small inconsistencies grow into larger questions, and curiosity begins to fill the silence. Tartaria exists in that space between evidence and imagination, where history feels incomplete, and the human mind instinctively tries to finish the story. It is not only the idea of a lost civilization that captures attention, but the possibility that time may have erased more than we realize. History often feels permanent when we read it in books, but in reality it is constantly being rewritten. New discoveries change interpretations, perspectives shift, and what once seemed certain becomes open to debate. Entire cultures have vanished from collective memory before, leaving behind only fragments that archaeologists and historians attempt to piece together centuries later. The difference with Tartaria is the emotional weight attached to the mystery. It suggests that something vast may have slipped quietly out of awareness, leaving behind traces that no longer fit neatly into accepted timelines. Yet perhaps the true power of this story lies in its symbolism. Tartaria represents the fear of loss, not only the loss of cities or knowledge, but the loss of continuity. People want to believe that progress always moves forward, that nothing valuable truly disappears. But history shows otherwise. Libraries burn, traditions fade, and innovations are forgotten until rediscovered generations later. Human civilization is not a straight path. It is a cycle of remembering and forgetting. There is also beauty in that realization. The past does not need to be fully understood to be meaningful. Sometimes mystery itself carries value. It encourages humility, reminding us that our understanding of history is limited by perspective. What we know today is shaped by what survived, not necessarily by everything that existed. Tartaria becomes a reminder that absence of explanation does not always mean absence of truth. Sometimes it simply reflects the passage of time. As this journey comes to an end, the story leaves behind a quiet question rather than a conclusion. How many other stories have been lost in similar ways? How many civilizations, ideas, or achievements disappeared not through destruction, but through gradual forgetting? The world is older and more complex than any single narrative can capture, and perhaps that is why mysteries like Tartaria continue to resonate. They remind us that history is alive, still unfolding, still open to interpretation, in the silence between known facts and unanswered. Red questions. Imagination keeps the past alive. And maybe that is where Tartaria truly exists, not only in history, but in the human desire to understand what came before us. Some stories refuse to end because they were never fully told. The tale of Tartaria feels like one of those stories, lingering at the edge of historical memory, inviting speculation while resisting certainty. When people encounter mysteries like this, they often search for definitive answers, hoping for a single explanation that makes everything clear. But history rarely offers that kind of simplicity. Instead, it leaves layers, perspectives shaped by time, culture, and interpretation. The fascination with Tartaria reveals something deeply human. We are drawn to the unknown because it challenges our assumptions. It forces us to question how history is preserved and who decides which stories endure. Over centuries, countless events have been simplified or forgotten entirely, not always through intention, but through the natural process of change. Languages evolve, borders shift, and societies redefine themselves. In that transformation, complexity is often reduced, leaving behind narratives that feel complete even when they are not. What makes this mystery powerful is the atmosphere it creates. Images of grand architecture, references scattered across old maps, and unexplained gaps in historical understanding combine to create a sense of something just beyond reach. Whether Tartaria was misunderstood, exaggerated, or partially lost to time, its story highlights an important truth. History is not a fixed monument. It is a living record, shaped by what survives and by what people choose to remember. There is also a quiet lesson hidden within this uncertainty. Human achievement, no matter how advanced, is temporary. Civilizations rise with confidence, believing their legacy will remain untouched, yet time eventually reshapes everything. What feels permanent today may become mysterious tomorrow. The same curiosity we feel when looking at the past may one day be felt by those looking back at us. As the narrative fades, what remains is not proof or denial, but reflection. Tartaria becomes a mirror, showing how easily certainty can dissolve into mystery. It reminds us to approach history with curiosity rather than absolute conclusions. The unknown is not always something to fear. Sometimes it is an invitation to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, to accept that not every story has a clear ending. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion of all. The past does not owe us complete explanations. Sometimes it leaves fragments, and it is up to each generation to decide what those fragments mean. In that space between knowledge and imagination, stories like Tartaria continue to live. In the end, every mystery returns to silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence that follows when questions remain unanswered. Tartaria exists within that silence, a story shaped as much by curiosity as by history itself. People search for lost civilizations because they represent possibility. The idea that the world once held knowledge, beauty, or achievements that slipped beyond recorded memory. Whether those ideas are fully accurate matters less than the feeling they create. They remind us that the past is larger than what survived. The passage of time has a way of simplifying everything. Complex realities become short explanations, and entire cultures are reduced to brief mentions in textbooks. Over generations, nuance disappears. Context fades. What remains is only what was preserved well enough to endure. Tartaria, in many ways, symbolizes what happens when preservation fails. The gaps become as important as the facts themselves, inviting interpretation and imagination to fill what is missing. But there is also responsibility in how we approach such mysteries. Curiosity should inspire exploration, not certainty without evidence. The beauty of history lies in its complexity, in the understanding that multiple perspectives can exist at once. Tartaria may never have a single clear definition, and perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate people across the world. It represents the tension between what is known and what is suspected, between documentation and storytelling. As this journey closes, the focus shifts from the mystery itself to the lesson it leaves behind. Civilizations are temporary, but curiosity endures. The desire to understand the past connects generations across centuries. Each question asked keeps history alive, preventing it from becoming completely silent. Even when answers remain incomplete, the act of searching gives meaning to the unknown. Maybe the true legacy of Tartaria is not a lost empire or a hidden truth, but a reminder. A reminder that history should be approached with humility, that certainty can fade, and that the world has always been more complex than simple explanations allow. The past is not a finished story. It is an ongoing conversation between memory and discovery. And as the final moment fades, nay, thought remains. Perhaps the greatest mysteries are not meant to be solved completely. They exist to remind us that beyond every known story, there is always more waiting to be understood.